You're watching LMCC.
Good morning. Welcome to Westonka Memories. My name is Pam Myers, and I volunteer with the Westonka History Museum. Today I'm talking with Ron Pauly, local resident who grew up in our area and whose family has been here for decades and decades. Good morning, Ron.
Good morning.
So tell me about, how did your family come to be in our neighborhood?
Well, in the mid-1800s to later on, a lot of the Paulys migrated over to this country and ended up in the state. And they actually came up the Minnesota River, and some of them went to Chanhassen, some of them went to Chaska, some to Carver. My particular family came up to St. Bonnie or Minnetrista at that time. There's a lake over in Carver County called Pauly Lake, who, according to my late Uncle George and Ken Heitz, who works for the Historical Society over in St. Bonnie, used to be Pauly Lake. And both those individuals tried to get the map changed and corrected to go back to Pauly instead of Parley. Several of my relatives laid claim to property on this on the north side of Pauly Lake, but there was a dispute about somebody else had put claim to it or whatever, so they ended up not getting those parcels. But in 1872 then, my great-grandfather ended up getting the parcel in Minnetrista that is currently directly across from the fire hall in St. Bonnie. It's now a housing development, but the original farmhouse that my dad grew up in and I grew up in is still there, but it's been added on to, and they took the stucco off of it and put regular siding on it, and et cetera. So I've got a lot of pictures of the house and the family way back then standing by that house.
You grew up in that same house?
Yes. When my father was, and his siblings were young, they added on to the house, so that summer my father and his brothers slept in the granary while they were adding on to it. So, yes, I grew up in that house, and I remember I was 6 years old when we got indoor plumbing instead of going to the woodshed to go to the bathroom. And his nephew helped him dig the hole for the septic tank. I even have a picture of that. It was a crop farm, and I think it was maybe, 1942, I believe, is when he purchased the parcel from his father. He had two brothers that previously tried to farm. Hubert Pauly farmed a little bit on it, and he ended up, this is back in the Depression days, he ended up going to down south, and he met a woman down there, Nora, who came from a well-off farm family, and he learned carpentry down there, but he ended up marrying her, and then he ended up moving up here to Mound and build houses and such. And he was in the World War I, and because he grew up on a farm back in World War I, oh, a good job for you is to take care of the horses and mules. So that's what he did in World War I for the most part. And he ended up, like I said, lived in Mound. He lived in his own home until he was 99, and then he ended up moving into the Presbyterian homes. But he ended up almost living to be 107. Now, my other uncle, well, I've got a lot of uncles, but the other one who I'm really most proud of was my Uncle Ray, who was about 30 years old or something like that when he enlisted in the Army for World War II. And the reason being, he figured, I know German, and that might be an asset. So he ended up going into World War II, and he stood up when my folks got married. He was one of the best men in the wedding, so I even got a picture of that. He ended up, was a staff sergeant, and he ended up in the European theater and was in the Battle of the Bulge.
Wow.
And when I was young, he didn't want to talk about the war. I kept prodding him, and he'd slowly open up about it. And because he was an old guy, relatively speaking, he had people reporting to him, or soldiers reporting to him, that were almost like his kids.
I suppose.
And one story he told me was they were down in a foxhole, and he said this one kid had been brought up in a house with indoor plumbing, and such. And what the soldiers would typically do, like in the winter, they would go into farmhouses or whatever, and if they could, they'd take the white sheets so they could cover up the hole to where they were going in their underground tunnel. But he said they were tied down in this one spot, and all of a sudden this young boy had to go to the bathroom. And my uncle and the other fellas down in the foxhole ended up, you go in here, it's too dangerous. And they argued and pleaded with him, and he ended up, nope. And so he was going to go outside, and he didn't get any more than his head above the white sheet and got shot in the head and slid back down into the hole. So,
dear.
He had a lot of stories. I mean, other officers would say, if you get a chance, you go with Pauly, he'll take care of you. And in the Battle of the Bulge, all they did every night is, when the sergeant, they try and get together, okay, how many did you lose today? Yeah. And he said, it appears as though we knew more about what was going on here in this country than they did. So, but anyway, they got through that, and that kind of officially ended in January or so, and I think it was 45, whatever, but in the next battle, he and others got caught, and he spent the rest of the war in a German prison camp.
Oh my.
And he was was probably 6'5" or something like that, and 250 pounds. He was a big fella. He ended up in a monastery down in Iowa, getting nursed back to health after he got home from the war. So, well, enough about kind of his story. But my father stayed because he was a farmer. They wouldn't typically they wouldn't want the farmers to come. They wanted them to keep raising cattle and corn, etc., things that were needed for the war effort. So my father was on that 79 acres, and he was the one that made it. Now, the brother after Herbie was Clemens, and he farmed there, and it wasn't really all that, he didn't do all that good, and he met, I don't know how he did it or what, he met a woman from southern Minnesota, from Easton, Wells area. Oh, surprise, surprise. And she was from a farming family that was doing okay. So Clemens ended up marrying Emma and moved down to Easton, and then Dad moved onto the farm and bought it from his father. So that's how he ended up farming there. In 1946 or 47 or something like that, he decided the heck with cattle, raising cows, etc. And he tore the barn down and sold it to Arthur Ahold, who was living in Mound kind of after he retired across from the Catholic school. But this, he rebuilt the barn on his farm, which was down the hill from the Nike missile site over in Minnetrista. So anyway, my dad decided he's going to be a crop farmer.
Okay.
So it was very common to have, and he rotated crops, alfalfa and corn, or some years he'd have sweet clover, and then he would plow it under. But Uncle Ray, my father, and the youngest brother, Robert, went to the University of Minnesota Farm School over in St. Paul. So that's where they got their education. So after the war, Uncle Ray ended up opening a greenhouse in Deep Haven. Uncle Bob ended up north and married a gal up there and had a greenhouse that is situated right in front of the Catholic Church up in Easton, up in Walker when you come in. And Dad just, he stayed on the farm and raised crops. Well, the original farm was 79 acres, so then he ended up east of that parcel. There's a road that runs north and south from what used to be called Breezy Hill, was a tavern on 110 going to Mound. So there was a parcel of land east of that road that went up to where the railroad, Great Northern Railroad was, and now it's the Dakota Trail. So Dad bought that and then a couple of other parcels, so there was a triangle piece of land that was surrounded by roads and the railroad track. So we ended up, he farmed 120 acres. In some years he would have 100 acres of corn, etc. And he always rotated. And when he moved in, I remember I was young, a lot of gullies and stuff like that, and some of them from rain running down the hills. We had a narrow front tractor, so when you were holding onto the steering wheel, if you didn't hold it right, and the front wheels ended up going like that, he said, the heck with it. So he hired Cox Brothers, who were down here in Spring Park, and had an excavation company and a ready-mix company, but he hired Cox Brothers to go and rework all the ditches where the water would run off, and then he planted grass. So we never had to worry about that again. Sure, he didn't have crops right up to the edge there or all the way through, but he was a conservationist of such.
Sounds like it.
After he retired, he rented the land out to a farmer north of us, and the son of a gun never picked the plow up, and he went and undid it, and it washed again.
Oh dear.
But
when you first started talking about your grandparents and great-grand coming from Germany, it made me think of school. There must have been a lot of German spoken in those schools in those days.
well, certainly. I mean, the nuns spoke German.
So this was a Catholic, German Catholic community?
Over in St. Bonnie. And the school used to be a 2-story red brick facility and I've got pictures of that, so that they tore down to build the school, which was a single level that sits across from the ballpark over in St. Bonnie. But the Catholic school that my father went to and I went to had 4 classrooms, 1st and 2nd grade, the 3rd and 4th, and the 5th and 6th, and 7th and 8th. So, like Sister Honorata was the teacher in the 1st grade that was a little bit rough. She must have been 80 years old or 70 years old. And then when I went into the 2nd grade, then Sister Barbara came, and she was a young gal and really nice. So then kitty corner across, the 3rd and 4th grade, was Sister Georgiana. And then next, the 5th and 6th grade was Sister Ottilia, and Sister Ottilia came and she taught, but she was originally down in St. Paul, and a good friend of hers was in the business of selling vestments and for the priests and outfits for the altar boys and things like that. So we were some of the fanciest altar boys in the country. I mean, we had red cassocks with white satin, well, I'm maybe not pronouncing or saying the fabric right, but sashes and capes and stuff. And,
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, it was really something. Yeah, I was an altar boy, I don't know, maybe 3rd grade or something like that. I started. And I remember Archbishop John Gregory Murray came out to do the confirmation. And I had my lace on top and the cassock and stuff, and I had this big hymnal or book, mass book, and I was supposed to hold it in front of him so he could read out of it.
Sure.
And he looked at me, he said, "You can put that on my lap." So I'll never forget that. I mean, it was little things like that.
Absolutely.
And then Sister Ottilia, some of us, one of the families that lived over there was so poor that we all had bicycles. But this one family, farm family, they lived across from Upland Farm on the south side of Upland Farm. And the bicycle tire, if it would wear out and get a hole in it and expose the tube, they put another tire on it that was wore out and rotated it so that it wouldn't have a hole in it. I mean, but it's so some of the poorer kids, we weren't rich, don't get me wrong, but some of the really poor kids come to serve Mass. Well, Sister Ottilia had a bowl of water and soap and a wash rag and a towel, and she would scrub them up so they wouldn't get the white collar or whatever dirty and stuff, and so they, were respectable. So, I mean, wonderful memories for that.
Mm-hmm. Terrific. Someone told me a story that the students sang at services at church. Was that part of your memory at all?
Oh, yes.
So tell me how that happened. Was it part of the church day? Part of the school day? Or
Yeah.
was it particular services? Was it weddings and funerals?
No. We went to church every day
Okay.
Before school started.
And singing was part of
yeah.
that.
So, yeah. We had an adult choir over there, but even, growing up, once I got out of school, they were always encouraging the people to sing out of the hymnals or whatever.
For sure. So tell me what you know about the changeover from the nuns teaching in German to teaching in English.
All I know, and maybe this isn't even fact, but what I seem to remember is that the state of Minnesota all of a sudden dictated that enough of this German or Swedish or Norwegian or whatever, that the state, we got the language in this country is English, basically, so start teaching English.
And that was about when? Was that a World War II?
No, that
issue?
was before. My father was maybe in the second grade when that happened.
So that would have been about when?
Maybe in the 20s.
Were there any traditions in your household growing up that your mom or dad brought to your family that were German traditions?
We had, sauerkraut and stuff like that. I don't know.
Not particularly.
Nothing jumps out that was really specifically German.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, our diet was generally German, but
Sure.
I mean, nothing really jumps out.
True. So as you were growing up there, you were a farm kid?
Mm-hmm.
So what were your duties on the farm?
And I've got a brother who's a couple years younger. We'd have to go out and hoe thistles or pull mustard or whatever, and my brother would typically, I got to go to the bathroom, and you can go right here in the field. I got to go up to the house, and so he'd run up the hill or something in the house, and that was the end of him. But I was with my dad. When I got old enough and my legs and arms and everything were long enough or whatever so that I could apply the brakes and the clutch or whatever on a tractor, my father purchased another tractor. So I was like his hired man, So I remember we had the well, and my dad we were picking corn, I think it was, and there was we had a pump on the well outside, and it had the one pulley was probably that big around with spokes on it and a double V belt, and my father had there was a second well next to the original farm well that was in a little building, but this one, they sunk the well right alongside outside, so his kids wouldn't get in trouble or whatever, he had a snow fence put around it. Well, there was a dead spot in the electric motor, and once in a while it would just hum, and Dad was in a hurry, and he reached through the snow fence, and all of a sudden it took off and it cut his two fingers. He got caught in that double V belt thing.
Oh, goodness.
So the doctor was able to save it, but I ended up in spring being the major person to get the land ready and planting the crops and stuff like that. So, and he also did custom hay baling. You know, he was a Reichenberger family over south of St. Bonnie had one of the few hay balers, New Holland balers around at that time. That was in the 40s, and you know, when you have cut and windrow the hay, you know, you don't want it to lay out there for a lot of time. Well, sometimes it would rain or whatever, and it would be a week or two sometimes before the guy'd get around to it, because he'd get backed up, and he was doing custom hay baling too.
Sure.
So my dad said, the heck with it. So he went and bought a New Holland baler and started doing that. Well, I would go with him, and I mean, as soon as the dew came off, until it got dark, sometimes all we did was bale hay for people. And sometimes, you know, Dad would pile up some bales and create a shady spot in the middle of the field, and then he'd lay down and rest for a while, and then I would keep baling. So we'd trade off baling, you know, when one of us got tired or so. But yeah, I was almost like his shadow all my life.
I bet you were. I bet you learned some lessons about work by working with him.
He was a hard worker. Also, he stressed being honest. If you work for somebody and you don't think you're getting paid enough, instead of starting to screw off and not working hard, quit and find a job, you know, that pays what you want. But when you work for somebody, work hard for them and be honest about it. So, I mean, his work ethic and income taxes, I mean, to this day, I don't, and my daughter and my son are the same way. If we don't have a receipt for a deduction or something, like from church for collections or whatever, we don't claim something where you could get by based on your income. You could probably fudge a little here and there. And my father didn't, I didn't, and my son and daughter don't fudge, even though sister-in-law, who's done our taxes for years, you know, she gave up a few years ago and said, well, you know, we could throw maybe a couple $100 here or there, and you'd still be way below something that would trigger an audit, you know. But no, you pay what you're supposed to pay. If everybody did that, you know, we wouldn't be in the financial straits we are in this country. So, I mean, it was, my father didn't, well, you know, he'd drink a beer or a drink once in a while, but I mean, he was not nowhere near an alcoholic. He and my mother would go to dances over in Waconia at the Paradise Ballroom that was just across from the lake and stuff, and, you know, old time, you know, polkas and waltzes and schottisches and stuff like that. And so that's what I ended up doing too. But I mean, yeah, I didn't have to worry about my father ever getting drunk or drinking too much. Couple beers was usually enough.
So he was quite a role model, wasn't he, for you?
Yes.
Yeah.
He also had a little German stubborn streak.
Really? You wouldn't have inherited that.
And I inherited that, and plain spoken. Mm-hmm. You know, I didn't try, and sometimes it didn't come across you know, maybe harsh to some people, but I mean, it is what it is, you know, and didn't beat around the bush. So you knew where he was coming from, and like I say, I'm the same way for the most part.
For sure. Those are wonderful lessons to have learned from your dad.
He was also, my mother suffered from, in the winter, I forget what you call it, she'd go into a funk when you don't have, the sun isn't shining a lot. For the most part, my father kept house and did most of the cooking every winter. You know, so it was crazy, so anyway.
Well, it's great to hear about your dad. If we think about you, when I wrap up these interviews, I typically ask the person, how would you like to be remembered?
I'm not stupid, I'm not a genius. I would like to be remembered that I accomplished a lot. I was honest. I was my wife may disagree, I don't know, but I was a good husband. We've been married 54 years.
Wow.
And she's a wonderful person. My son and daughter, I'm proud of them. Haven't borrowed money to buy a vehicle since 1984.
Oh my goodness.
We just bought a used Honda CRV for $21,000. Had the cash to do that. The State Bank of Mound got a hold of us, and Wells Fargo, I should say, because we're one of their, out here in Mound, one of their better customers, because we got a fair amount of money in the bank.
Good for you.
Instead of, credit rating is 833,
Oh, goodness.
850 is the highest you can get. I worked for, I was a sheet metal worker, and back in went to Dunwoody to take up sheet metal work. Well, first I was going to be an industrial arts teacher. Because Norm Olson, my shop teacher over in Waconia in the high school where St. Bonnie kids went, didn't have metal working, but drafting and hand woodworking and machine woodworking and stuff. And Norm Olson grew up in Menominee, Wisconsin. And that's where Stout State is. Industrial arts, that's what they were really known for back then, and now they're in packaging and stuff like that. So I went down there for a semester, which was $900 in the fall of 1960. They split the freshman class up, and half of the class would take psychology and other calculus, and calculus was the class they weeded out the freshmen with. Well, when I went to high school, I was not a whiz-bang with math, and I ended up, the state required that I pass an algebra class before I graduated, so I took algebra and got a D, so I passed.
I see.
So then I go to Stout, and I end up in the section, well, they had two teachers, one that had flunked calculus when they went there, and the other, a fellow from Germany, fundamentals, whenever we'd ask a question, you should have had that in high school. Well, almost our whole section flunked calculus.
Oh.
We had to turn around and repeat it. Well, there was no way in heck I was going to pass that. But even the fellows that were in the dorm that watched out for us, one of them flunked calculus when he was a freshman, but then he took it over the summer and passed it, so then he moved on. So it was a common issue. So, but I was exposed to sheet metal. Bernie Melchesky down here in Mound, and He was married to Mary, who was a sister of Charlie Groshen, who was an executive in charge of R&D at Tonka Toys. I lost my train of thought.
I think that I'm going to need to stop you
Okay.
because we've gone over our 30 minutes.
Okay.
So I'm going to close this, and then we'll talk about what we're going to do with the next part.
Okay.
So thank you for sharing some of your family history with us today. We've learned a lot about the Germans coming and your family farming. So thank you, Ron, for spending time with us today.
You're welcome.